The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hey guys, Paeter here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now I'm going to attempt to examine the Bible and dissect some of the churchy language we can really easily take for granted, digging into history and languages as I'm able anyway, to try and get at the heart of the text so that we can hopefully see and then apply at least some of what God has for you and me in these words today. Now, I am not formally trained in Scripture. I'm just a guy using resources and a questioning mind to try and get at the truth, and that's something that we can all do, so I hope that you will join me in that. We're in the middle of our Proverbs study again, and we've arrived at Proverbs chapter 10, verses 11 through 14, which in the ESV reads, "The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. On the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks sense." The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. So in these four Proverbs, we've got two that contrast righteousness with evil, that's 11 and 12, and then two that contrast wisdom and foolishness, 13 and 14. So we're going to look at those first two, starting with verse 11. "The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence." Now, we saw the phrase, "the mouth of the wicked conceals violence," back in Proverbs 10:6, and observed at that time how antagonistic intentions can be concealed by us or represented as something righteous, like piety or zeal. But here in verse 11, we see an indication of one way to tell the difference between the words of someone in line with God and the words of someone who is merely being antagonistic. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. This idea elsewhere in Proverbs refers to welfare and avoiding danger. That's the sense in which we're talking about a fountain of life. So a righteous person's words improve and preserve the lives of others. Now, of course, it's always possible for words from a righteous person to fall on deaf ears and be rejected. We experience that a lot in life. But the more normal outcome is that those who hear the words of someone who is really in line with God's intentions and values, the more normal outcome is that they'll be better off as a result. Their lives will be improved in some way. So as geeks, when we find that people are reacting to us negatively, instead of being better off, if our words create conflict, when we share our thoughts on things when our intent is actually to help, then I think at that point it's worth examining ourselves to see if there's something outside of God's will that sort of smuggled itself in with our good intentions and sort of tainted our motives in some way that we haven't quite recognized yet. Are we bringing any jadedness, bitterness, pride, frustration, or impatient anger into our interactions with people that end with them being frustrated or angry or creating conflict? So those things that I mentioned that can kind of smuggle their way in, they can result in that sort of violence that verse 11 I think is talking about. We can also ask, is there any desire on our part to be seen or respected a certain way, to have a certain image in the minds of other people? Or are we truly and purely motivated by a love that wants to build up and preserve those we're talking to? So those are things to consider when our words are not having the really what should be the normal result of being a fountain of life for other people. Okay, verse 12. "Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses." Continuing to contrast righteousness with evil, this proverb specifically contrasts the relational effects of hatred and love. Although we may think that our hatred of people can go unseen, and I would just focus on that because I think very few of us would have a form of hatred that's, being verbalized and stuff. I think the much more common version of hatred is something that we harbor in our thoughts and we feel it every time we think of that person, and we might think that that's going unseen or can go unseen, but it still tends to create conflict. It's naive and short-sighted if we think that the hatred we quietly hold on to will not eventually create bigger and very visible problems. And on the way to doing that, it's going to also create other problems that we don't recognize are already being kind of nurtured and rot that is festering that we don't even see yet because we're harboring that hatred in ourselves. The Hebrew word for love here is used in the Old Testament both for human love and God's love for humans. The two are intended to have the same quality and purity. The nature of God's love is ultimately revealed in the self-sacrifice of Jesus, in both the way he lived and the way that he died. The love that covers all offenses here is not merely being nice or polite. It's not sweeping offenses under the rug. It's not simply being kind either. It's a love that's rooted in a selfless concern and compassion for another person, which we find grounds and motivation for as we reflect on and respond to the love that God has for us, the love that he's expressed to us and acted out for us through Jesus. Love does not cover offenses in the sense of like making up for them. Only God through Christ makes up for human sin. But this proverb makes the observation that when we love others authentically and effectively, offenses and grudges tend to either recede or find reconciliation as love overtakes and becomes the defining part of our relationships. In the next two Proverbs, 13 and 14, wisdom and foolishness are contrasted. First, verse 13, on the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found. So the understanding and wisdom, we'll look into that because they are kind of distinct things here. On the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. The subtle connective tissue is again how people perceive or react to the wise and the foolish. The Hebrew word for understanding here is also translated as discerning and has a sense of being critically perceptive. It doesn't merely describe someone who has a mental Rolodex of facts, who's done a lot of studying of the Bible and just knows a boatload of factoids. No, it's rather someone who is a careful thinker as they navigate all the circumstances of life. The person who has developed this way of living is known for it when they speak, because their words tend to contain useful wisdom for the situation at hand. There are wise people I know for whom I just kind of like wait in anticipation during a group conversation, like, okay, are they going to say something? When are they going to say something? I look over, I see them just kind of like silently taking things in, as other people are kind of prattling on with their wordy opinions. I wait for so-and-so to break their silence eventually, because when they do, they always seem to bring something worthwhile to the conversation, a worthwhile and useful perspective. And that's the kind of people that we want to aspire to be as well. By contrast, the foolish person tends to need frequent correction, and sometimes in an intense form. Of course, kids experience this from their parents, and employees who make foolish choices are sometimes in need of sharply worded correction, suspension, or maybe even termination. So the reminder here is that wisdom will help us avoid those hard life lessons that just play out as a result of our foolish choices. Okay, verse 14 then to finish up. The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. A subtle element of the contrast here is that the wise person does not speak. He's just laying up knowledge. There's nothing about him saying anything in this proverb. He gathers knowledge without speaking, while the fool speaks without knowledge. In addition to being carefully discerning, as the first of these paired verses highlights, the wise person in verse 14 also commits to memory those things they have discerned are true. They are laying up that knowledge. I will readily confess, I'm sad to say, that this is really a weak area for me. I tend to be, I think, a relatively careful thinker, but the knowledge of Scripture that I have mentally stored and at the ready in a given moment is just dwarfed by other men I know and respect in my church who seem to be able to just bring to their lips the Scripture that's relevant to the thing we're talking about or wrestling with or whatever. And I so admire that and really have so much space to grow in that area. The idea of laying up knowledge here really has a very broad application, but it also, as I kind of maybe alluded to there, reminds me of the specific value of scripture memorization. That's not something that I grew up with, and I think largely because growing up in the kind of Sunday school classes that I was at before, reaching high school, where about that time we started going to the church that I'm at now and have been since high school. But before that, some of the churches my family went to, it was pretty basic curriculum. It was just, and so there was memory verses. You'd memorize the verse, you get a lollipop or whatever if you have it memorized the next week. But there wasn't, a lot of really down to earth discussion about why is this verse relevant to what I'm going to be experiencing at school or at home with my sisters or my parents or whatever, And so it wasn't until much later in life when I, when it's harder to kind of develop new habits and stuff, that I saw the value of tactical scripture memorization. Whereas I figure out what the problem is first, then I see in scripture what the answer, what the response is to that, and then I choose to memorize that specifically and tactically, not just, the 50 greatest hits of scripture memorization, but the stuff that's really relevant to me and what I'm struggling with and what I need in the moment on different occasions to be reminded of. Then scripture memorization became so much more relevant. Well, it became relevant, period, in my life. But it's still, sadly, not something I've been good at developing as a discipline. So anyway, but yeah, we live in this world of mobile devices where it's really easy to kind of mentally slack off and tell ourselves, well, I can look up anything that I need to remember. I've got a good data plan, But in the split-second moments of mental crossroads, I mean split seconds where we don't have time, we need the truth in our minds in much quicker time than it takes to get out our phone, assuming we're in a situation where it wouldn't be weird to do that and suddenly give our attention to our phone. No, we need that truth instantly in our minds, ready to go and respond to whatever the thought is, the temptation is, the struggle is, the puzzle is in front of us, to have it right there and ready to go when we're facing temptation or anxiety. It's these mentally stored up truths that we have prioritized in our lives that can make all the difference, just kind of bursting into our thoughts in the moment when we need them. So it is a worthwhile habit to put into our routines, things that involve acquiring and storing up wisdom in our minds, whether that's scripture memorization or just acquiring knowledge and wisdom that we meditate on, and in that way, it can really be present in our thoughts throughout the day. By contrast now, the fool speaks without thought, having not stored up the valuable truths needed for the present moment. The result is that they bring ruin to their situation and to those influenced or affected by their words. Now, the Hebrew word for ruin here implies both terror and destruction, so it's actually pretty extreme. A complete dissolving of stability, safety, and security. Now, foolish words often do not instantly bring this about, but Proverbs and just wisdom in general are about being forward thinking. And the writer here is warning that the ultimate result of thoughtless speech is life-altering devastation. And of course, we're going to see problems in smaller increments as we make our way to the life-altering devastation that comes from thoughtless speech as a way of life. In today's culture, this warning against the speech of fools, I think, would just as easily apply to words typed online, where so much is said without care or consideration. We can find ourselves justifying our strong self-expression as being real or being honest, or I've heard the word bold used before, when really it's abrasiveness. It's not boldness. Boldness is kind of like this internal thing. It's like I have a boldness that then leads to my action. But that action itself doesn't necessarily have this really strong intensity to it. Rather, it's the strong intensity of boldness that we have in the Spirit that leads us to take an action. But taking that action and speaking still requires thought, still requires tact, given the situation, given the people that are going to be hearing or reading our words, And so I think if we're honest, what we call being real, being honest, being bold, sometimes it's just giving free rein to expressing ourselves without careful consideration of how is best or when is best to express certain things. Online discourse also strikes me as having something of a position culture that tempts us to speak without thinking. I think that's a temptation, a facet of online communication that's worth being aware of, because it by nature, I think, tempts us to speak thoughtlessly. By that I mean that everyone, I feel like, is sort of expected to have a position on something, on the hot button issues of the day, you know. So when certain issues become hot buttons, we take to Twitter or YouTube comments and in one or two sentences declare where we stand on an issue. There's some news story, da-da-da-da, and so we reply to that in a reply tweet with this brief statement saying, in contrast to that or in support of that, whatever our position is, whatever our opinion is, and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that that's foolish as a rule, but reactionary declarations like these tend to be overly simplistic, not based in knowledge we have carefully and thoughtfully accumulated on an issue, but based on a felt need to sound off and let people know where we stand. The result so often is just adding more stink and division to the discourse that's happening online. And this puts fuel on fires of angry division and contributes in a broader sense to the ruin in our culture at large, but also to our relationships with others. And I think that's part of the broader concept of ruin the writer of this proverb is warning about when they say the mouth of fools brings ruin near. We're creating this chaos, this instability, this destruction when we speak thoughtlessly. So in summary, when we as geeks develop the traits of love and wisdom, we find that our relationships and interactions are not only better, but we also improve the lives of those we interact with and avoid some hard life lessons ourselves. If you would like some help finding a good church in your area, I would love to help you do that if I can. Online resources and communities are good supplements, but by their very nature, they can't speak to your particular situation like relationships in a local church can. The context for almost everything in the New Testament assumes that we are serving and building purposeful relationships in a local church. So whether you're in a church that lacks Bible-based intentionality or maybe not attending any church at all right now, if I can help you get connected to an authentic, compassionate, Bible-oriented church, I would love to do that. Email me, please, paeter@spiritblade.com, and we can try to look at some websites of churches in your area together.